There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store.
And so now Jesus, he stops talking about the Pharisees and he warns his disciples not to collect titles like the Pharisees do. And he tells them, he says, you're all equal. You're all brothers and sisters. And that to address somebody as a spiritual father is wrong. And that's because there is nothing between us and God in our relationship. And Jesus, he tells us right here, he says that our spiritual father is actually the God of heaven. And in the same way, our spiritual teacher, he tells us in the same way, he says, is one. We all have one, and that is the Christ. So he's telling us that's Jesus himself. And then he uses this other word for teacher. This is a different word, which is used over in verse 8, which is translated master. When he says teacher, it means master, but it means it like being a guide. So Jesus himself is to be our one master, our one guide, because Jesus knew that we would fall into the same traps that the Pharisees did. And we see this. This happens in the church, where you have all these different teachers who have these honorary degrees, and we call them doctor, or we might call them reverend. And there's so many different Christian denominations, and we all read the same passages. So you wonder, well, how did they come up using these exact same terms for their clergy? How do they go around calling each other father? You would think they would call them anything but that, besides father or calling him master, because you would think we would at least listen to Jesus in the obvious things. But somehow they can ignore these scriptures as if they're not there. And they're the guys that are actually supposed to be teaching the scriptures. Now, this is not saying that you can't call your biological dad father, but it is wrong to address somebody as a spiritual leader as father. And so what we should get out of this is that our relationship is a one-on-one relationship with God himself, each of us individually. And the only mediator that we have between God the Father and us is actually Jesus Christ the Son. And that's for all of us, that there is no person here on earth that is ever to be between us and God. And that our relationship with each other, we're all just equals. And then for the second time, Jesus teaches here, he says, he who is the greatest among you shall be your servant, which is the same thing he had just taught before the triumphal entry when all the disciples were arguing about who is going to be the greatest disciple among them. And now Jesus, he goes on again and he starts denouncing the Pharisees and he gives 8 woes. And this is in contrast to the 8 beatitudes that he gave earlier in Matthew. And then he goes on and he calls the Pharisees hypocrites. And he calls them hypocrites 7 times. And the word hypocrite comes from the word hypocritus, which means playing an actor, an assumed character. This is one who wears a mask. It's a stage actor. It's like all those actors in the Greek plays where they wore masks. And so now Jesus here, he's pulling back the mask and he's revealing who these actors really are and what the Pharisees actually look like. Because you have to realize these guys, they looked good when they're all in their costumes. These guys would have looked like the most respectable people in all of Israel. And now Jesus is saying they're not going to heaven and that they're actually standing in the doorway, keeping other people from going in. And the verb here indicates that those people that they're keeping out, they really are trying to get in. And so Jesus, he gives his second woe, and he calls them hypocrites, about how they're just a bunch of con men. They're a bunch of charlatans, cheating old widow women out of their homes. And they're wrapping it all up in their robes of religion and their long prayers. And he tells us, he says, that those prayers are just pretend prayers. And it's all just covetousness and greed on their part. And they're only pretending to care. They're trying to talk them out of their livings. They're ripping them all off in the name of God. And if you notice, that hasn't really changed much, because today we'll see the televangelists, and they're trying to get the elderly's retirement funds and trying to sweet talk those old ladies. They do it all in the name of religion. And here it says that God will pay them back with a greater condemnation. And then there's the next woe, and that's how the Pharisees and how these hypocrites work so hard to make one proselyte. And what a proselyte was a Gentile who converted to Judaism. And so it was a Gentile who accepted the same legalistic type of Judaism that they proclaimed. And so that means they accepted all the ceremonial laws, and they accepted circumcision. But the Pharisees, they weren't winning these men to God, but they were just winning them to their form of legalism, to their own belief systems. So this was never a conversion of the heart. And it's saying that these proselytes would become greater legalists than their teachers. And so instead of you have the Pharisees going around saving souls, they were actually condemning souls. And what this reminds me of how much energy that the Mormons use and how the Jehovah's Witnesses use when they go around trying to make their converts. And they're converting them also into a false belief system. Now it's just made up by men. And then Jesus, now he calls them a son of hell, which means he's calling them basically a son of the devil. And then he says they're blind guides, because these guys, they don't even see where they're going. And so they can't lead anybody anywhere. And then Jesus talks about the oaths that these guys have been making. Because you see, the Jews, in their obedience to God, they would never swear an oath in God's name. They'd never use the name of God, because it's commanded in Exodus 27 not to do that. So what they would do, since they couldn't do that, they built this elaborate, complicated systems of oaths, where some oaths, well, they would be considered to be binding, but others, well, they would just say that they weren't binding. It's like how, we talked earlier, how they had always made loopholes for themselves. So this making of an oath was like them saying, well, I didn't really mean it. I had my fingers crossed behind my back. So I really don't need to do what I said I was going to do. And what they were doing is they were actually constructing these types of oaths to deceive people, to deceive them, and to cheat them. So they could make these great oaths and never be intending to keep them. But to understand the oaths, you had to be on the inside. You had to know the rules of the oaths to know if an oath was binding or not binding. So you had to know the rules of the game. So Jesus, what he does is he goes on and he exposes their greedy, covetous hearts by what they consider to be binding according to their own oaths. And it's saying that the gold in the temple, that if you use that in your oath, that makes it binding. And what he's saying is that they thought more of the gold than they actually thought about the temple. But the gold is just gold. It's only the temple that actually sets that gold apart. And he says it's the same thing with the sacrifice. That the sacrifice without the altar, well, all it is just a barbecue. But it's the altar that makes that sacrifice holy. That's what sets that animal apart. And then Jesus, he goes on and he calls them blind. That's because they can't see it. They can't see what they're doing. And then he tells them that all your oaths are binding. Any oath that mentions God or the temple or the sacrifice or heaven. And then Jesus says that they're so legalistic with how they handle the law that they miss all the important things that are written in the law. They're missing the things of mercy and justice and faith. And Jesus, then he uses an example of how they're very, very careful and how they would count out like 9 anise seeds or cumin seeds when they're making their bread. And then they would give that 10th one and set it aside to tithe and to give to God. And when they were making their mint tea, they would do the same thing with the mint leaves to make sure they give God that 10th. And Jesus doesn't correct them and tell them that being that careful is wrong. But what he tells them, that it's wrong not to do the other things, the things that actually matter in people's lives, and to be able to treat people with mercy and by giving people justice. And then Jesus makes this joke about how careful they are not to swallow a gnat and how they would straining out. And what Jesus is getting at is because of their legalistic rules, they don't even see the big things, that they're missing it, that like they're swallowing these camels. And back then, if a Pharisee did swallow a gnat, what they would do is they would keep gagging themselves until they spit it out, because they believed, like even just with a gnat, that if it hadn't been bled properly, it would have made them unclean, because that's what the Jewish law says. And then Jesus, he goes on and he talks about how they wash their dishes, that they only wash the outside of their dishes. They only do the things that people can see because they are self-indulgent. And so the inside of their dishes were filthy dirty. And he's not just telling them just to wash the inside and not to wash the outside, but he's saying that they have to wash both, because you're to look clean on the outside, but you're also supposed to be clean on the inside. You're supposed to be both. You're not just to be one and not the other. So you're supposed to look moral, and you're also required to be moral. You're supposed to act righteous, but that's because you're supposed to be righteous. But these guys, they only looked on the outside, but on the inside, they had no spiritual life. And then Jesus says, you look like a cemetery. You're all pretty and white on the outside, and you look like a park-like setting, but on the inside, you're just a bunch of rotting flesh with bones. You're all dead on the inside. And what these guys would do is they would actually whitewash all the tombs. And they usually did this around like the feast times when there was more people in Jerusalem. And the reason they did this is that so nobody would accidentally step on any of the graves. Because if anybody unintentionally stepped on a grave and came in contact with, in any way, with any dead body, they would be unclean for 3 days. And so they wouldn't be able to go to the temple. And so now with Jesus on the topic of tombs, Jesus, he starts talking about how they decorated the dead prophets' graves and how they honored all the dead prophets. But it was always the live prophets that they persecuted. And so these Pharisees, they tell each other that they wouldn't have killed these prophets, and they say they wouldn't have acted like their fathers did. Now, when he's talking about their fathers, he's not talking about their biological fathers here. He's talking about their spiritual fathers. And he's talking about the hypocrites and the false prophets from the past ages, the ones of whose traditions they're following.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.